The dust in Dry Creek didn't just fall, it hung in the air. It coated your tongue. It worked its way into every crease of your clothes, a constant reminder that the world was bigger and drier than you were. And in the middle of this dusty street sat a cowboy. His name didn't matter. In towns like this, a name was a luxury. All that mattered was the dust on your shoulders and the coin in your pocket. He had plenty of the first, none of the second. In front of him sat a tin plate, beans and a single piece of bread. It was the first hot food he'd seen in 2 days, and he ate it slow. He knew when the plate was empty, he was empty too. The town watched him. They always watched strangers. Whispers drifted from the saloon porch, from the general store doorway. They measured him by the wear on his boots and the hunger in his posture. He was used to it. He kept his head down, his hat pulled low. He didn't want them to see the lines grief had carved around his eyes. He just wanted to finish his beans. Then he heard a voice. It wasn't loud. It was a whisper, small and thin, like a crack in a glass jar. "Grandma will whip me if I don't bring food." He looked up, and that's when his whole world tilted on its axis. She was tiny, no higher than his belt buckle. Her hair was a mess of dark tangles. Her dress was thin and torn at the knee. She stood with her bare feet pressed together, trying to make herself as small as possible, but her eyes were huge, gray as a storm cloud, and they were locked on his plate of beans. He'd known hunger. It was an old friend. It had shared his blanket on cold nights under colder stars. He understood its bite, its gnawing emptiness. But this was different. This was hunger in a child's eyes, and underneath the hunger there was something else. Fear. A deep, cold fear that had nothing to do with an empty stomach. It was a fear that cut him deeper than any trail dust or loneliness ever could. He cleared his throat. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Child," he said, "I got only this." He tapped the plate. "But I reckon half a plate is better than no plate at all." He pushed it across the table. Her eyes widened. She looked at him, then at the plate as if she couldn't believe it was real, as if she expected him to snatch it back, to laugh at her, his own stomach twisted into a knot. But he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the table. The girl reached out with trembling fingers. She grabbed the tin plate like it was the most precious thing in the world. She didn't sit. She knelt in the dust by the table leg, eating in small, frantic bites. She ate like she was afraid the food would vanish. Like any second someone would come and take it away. Across the street, the whispers got louder. "Shameful," a merchant muttered to his wife. "Gives his last meal to a beggar brat." The woman nodded, but her eyes stayed on the little girl. There was something in her gaze that wasn't judgment. It was closer to sorrow. The cowboy ignored them all. He watched the girl. He felt a warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with food. It was something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Between mouthfuls, the girl looked up at him. "Mister," she mumbled through a piece of bread, "do you think the sky keeps account of every empty belly?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He thought of all the nights he'd stared at that empty sky and cursed its silence. He swallowed hard. "I reckon it does," he said, his voice thick. "And I reckon it don't forget." A tiny smile touched her lips. It was faint, but it was real. And then he saw it, a shadow detaching itself from an alleyway. A woman. Bent and hard, with a face like a knotted rope. Her hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. She wasn't looking at the girl with concern. She was looking with pure, cold anger. The girl saw her too. Every muscle in her small body went rigid. The plate trembled in her hands. "That's Grandma," she whispered, and the fear in her voice was 1,000 times worse than the hunger had been. "She don't like me talking to strangers." The cowboy's jaw set like stone. He didn't take his eyes off the woman in the alley. He could feel her stare from across the street, sharp and hateful. It was the look of a predator. The girl huddled closer to the table, trying to hide behind his legs. His own hunger was a distant roar now. A new question was rising up from the dust, louder and more urgent. What kind of monster whips a child for being hungry? And what kind of man would he be if he just sat there and let it happen? The old woman started walking. Her steps were slow, deliberate. Each one seemed to shake the dust in the street. The town's murmuring died down, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Everyone wanted to see the show. The girl pressed her face against the cowboy's leg, her small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. The grandmother stopped in front of their table. Her eyes were like two chips of obsidian. They flicked from the girl to the cowboy, filled with a venom that made the air feel thick. "What's this?" she hissed, her voice thin and sharp. "Begging again? Shaming me in front of the whole town?" She reached down and grabbed the girl's arm. Her fingers were like talons digging into the child's thin skin. The girl cried out, a small choked sound. The cowboy rose to his feet. He didn't do it fast. He moved slowly, deliberately, letting his chair scrape against the wooden boardwalk. He didn't say a word. But the sheer size of him, the quiet threat in his stillness, made the old woman pause, just for a second. The crowd leaned in. This was what they were waiting for. "Please, Grandma," the girl sobbed. "He wasn't mean. He was kind." The word kind seemed to enrage the woman even more. Her face twisted into a snarl. "Kindness don't put wood in the stove. Kindness don't keep the wolves from the door." She yanked the girl, trying to pull her away. The tin plate clattered to the ground, scattering the last of the beans in the dust. The cowboy's voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't reckon kindness is a crime." A gasp went through the crowd. It wasn't just what he said, it was that he dared to say it. To a town elder. To kin. The grandmother's face flushed a dark, ugly red. "You're a stranger here, you have no say. She is my blood, and I will raise her as I see fit." She tightened her grip. The girl winced in pain. The cowboy's hand drifted toward the worn leather belt at his waist, but he stopped himself. A gun wouldn't solve this. But his silence was a weapon of its own. It was a wall the old woman's rage couldn't seem to break. The girl, seeing his stillness, seeing that he wasn't backing down, did something brave. She pulled her arm free from her grandmother's grasp. Her small hand reached out and brushed against the rough fabric of the cowboy's coat. It was just a touch, a feather-light plea, but it felt heavier than an anchor. He looked down at her trembling fingers, then back up at the furious old woman. The whispers from the crowd started again, meaner this time. Let her kin deal with her. Drifters just asking for trouble. But then the girl's voice, so quiet it was almost lost in the wind, pierced through it all. "Please," she whispered, looking up at him, "don't leave me." His chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. He was a drifter. Leaving was what he did. He never stayed long enough for roots to take hold. He never carried anyone's burden but his own. But as he looked into those terrified gray eyes, he knew. He was already caught. He bent down, his movements slow and careful, and picked up the empty tin plate from the dust. He wiped it clean with his thumb. Then he looked at the grandmother, and he made a decision that would not only change his life, but would uncover a secret this town had tried to bury for years. He didn't offer her money. He didn't threaten her. He just held out the plate. "She'll need this for supper," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an oath. The grandmother stared at the plate, then at him. Her face was a mask of confusion and fury. For a moment, it looked like she might strike him. But then, something shifted in her eyes. It wasn't fear of him, it was fear of something else entirely. She snatched the girl's hand again. "We're leaving!" she spat, and dragged the child toward the alley. But as she turned, she leaned in close to the cowboy, her voice a venomous whisper only he could hear. "You have no idea what you've just done," she hissed. "You've just painted a target on her back, and on yours." Before he could respond, she was gone, pulling the crying child into the shadows. The crowd started to disperse, their entertainment over. They went back to their lives, their whispers fading into the afternoon heat. The cowboy stood alone in the street. The empty tin plate felt cold in his hand. a target on her back. What did that mean? This wasn't about a cruel grandmother and a hungry child. This was about something much, much darker, and he had just walked right into the middle of it. The sun was bleeding across the horizon when the cowboy left the main street of Dry Creek. He didn't head for the saloon or the boarding house. He walked toward the east, following the path the old woman had taken. He had to know. The town thinned out fast, turning into cracked earth and skeletal sagebrush. The sounds of Dry Creek faded behind him, replaced by the lonely whisper of the wind. Up ahead he saw them. The old woman was practically dragging the little girl, who stumbled every few feet. He kept his distance, using the dying light and the sparse cover to stay hidden. They arrived at a cabin, or what was left of one. The walls sagged inward, the roof was a patchwork of rusted tin and hope, and the windows were just hollow, dark eyes staring out at nothing. No smoke came from the chimney, no light glowed from within. It wasn't a home. It was a tomb. The grandmother shoved the girl inside and slammed the flimsy door shut. The cowboy stood at the edge of the clearing, hidden by a dead tree. A faint, muffled cry reached him on the wind. It was a sound of such pure misery it made his teeth ache. He stayed there, watching, as the last light of day vanished and the prairie was swallowed by darkness. What kind of life was this for a child? After a long time, the cabin door creaked open. The grandmother came out with a bucket and headed toward a nearby rain barrel. This was his chance. He slipped from the shadows, moving silently across the clearing. The door was still ajar. He peered inside. The darkness was almost total, but a sliver of moonlight cut through a crack in the roof. It illuminated the girl. She was huddled by the fireplace, a place where a fire hadn't burned in a long, long time. She was rubbing her arms, her breath misting in the cold air. She wasn't just hungry, she was freezing, and she was utterly alone. That was it. That was the moment everything snapped into place for him. He'd slept cold 1,000 times, but that was his choice. The road was his master. This child had no choice. Her master was cruelty and cold. He stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the cabin. His boots crunched on the gravelly dirt. The grandmother spun around, her eyes wide with alarm. Then they narrowed into slits. "You!" she spat. "You followed us. Have you lost your mind?" He ignored her. His gaze went past her, into the dark cabin where the little girl was now staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a tiny, flickering spark of hope. "Ma'am," the cowboy said, his voice flat and even. "That child is cold. I came to build her a fire." The woman let out a harsh, barking laugh. "A fire won't save her. The world is a cold place. She needs to learn that now." "She's learning it just fine from you," he shot back. Without waiting for a reply, he started gathering fallen branches, dry sagebrush, anything that would burn. The grandmother watched him, her arms crossed, her face a storm of conflicting emotions. Anger, yes, but also exhaustion, and that same strange fear he'd seen before. He carried the wood inside and knelt by the cold hearth. The girl scurried back into a corner, watching him. He took out his flint and steel. It took a few tries, his hands stiff from the chill, but soon a spark caught. A tiny flame flickered to life. He fed it carefully, nurturing it, until a small, cheerful fire was crackling in the hearth. Warmth and light pushed back the darkness. The little girl slowly crept forward, drawn by the heat. She held out her small, chapped hands to the flames, a soft sigh escaping her lips. It was the sound of a prayer being answered. She looked at him, and the gratitude in her eyes was so pure it almost brought him to his knees. The grandmother stood in the doorway, a rigid silhouette against the night sky. "Don't think this changes anything," she hissed. "A little warmth just makes the cold feel worse when it comes back." The cowboy added another stick to the fire. "Maybe," he said without looking at her, "or maybe it gives you something to fight for." The girl moved closer to him, to the fire. Her tiny whisper was barely audible over the crackling wood. "You came back." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. He felt a small touch on his sleeve. He looked down. The girl was holding up a corner of her thin, ragged dress. Tucked into a hidden pocket was a small object. It was a beautifully carved wooden bird. Its wings were outstretched, and its tiny details were perfect. It was the work of a master craftsman. It was the only beautiful thing in this entire place of rot and decay. "My papa made it for me," she whispered, before he went away. Before he could ask what she meant, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Voices. And the bobbing lights of lanterns moving through the trees. They were coming closer. The grandmother's head snapped up, her face pale with panic. "They found us," she breathed. "They found her." The girl scrambled behind the cowboy, her little hands gripping the back of his coat. The wooden bird fell from her grasp and landed silently in the dirt. The cowboy stood up, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He looked out the door at the approaching lights. He had come here to build a fire. But it seemed he was about to walk into one. The lanterns weren't moving aimlessly. They were coming straight for the cabin. A posse. The cowboy stood in the doorway, the firelight at his back casting his shadow long and menacing across the clearing. The little girl was hidden behind him, clutching his coat so tight her knuckles were white. The grandmother was frozen by the hearth, muttering to herself, "Too late, it's too late." The first person to step into the clearing was the big ranch hand from the saloon. He was holding a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Behind him were a dozen other men from the town. The merchant, the blacksmith, even the preacher was there, though he hung back, his face troubled. They weren't a lynch mob, not yet. But they were close. Their faces were hard, their eyes filled with suspicion. They looked from the cowboy to the crumbling cabin, and their expressions darkened. "There he is," the ranch hand said, his voice a low growl. "Knew he was trouble the second I saw him." He took a step forward, raising the shotgun. "Step away from the girl, Drifter. You've got no business here." The grandmother finally spoke, her voice shrill with panic. "He followed us. He forced his way in. I told him to leave." It was a lie, and they all knew it. But in the tense, lantern-lit clearing, it was a lie some of the men wanted to believe. The girl peeked out from behind the cowboy's leg. Her voice was small but clear. "No, he brought us fire. He's nice." The ranch hand sneered. "Nice men don't follow women and children out into the dark, little one." The cowboy hadn't moved a muscle. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously calm. "I followed them because I saw a child who was hungry and cold. I saw an old woman full of hate. I wanted to know why." He looked directly at the ranch hand. "Now it looks like I'm about to find out." The preacher stepped forward. "Hold on, Jebediah. Let's not be hasty. There's been no crime committed here." "No crime?" Jebediah roared. "This drifter is in a cabin with a child that ain't his. After what happened to her folks, we can't take any chances." What happened to her folks? The words hung in the air. The cowboy looked down. In the dirt near his boot, he saw the small wooden bird the girl had dropped. He bent down slowly and picked it up. He held it in his palm. "Her papa made this," he said, holding it up for them to see. "She told me, right before you all showed up with guns." A strange silence fell over the group of men. They stared at the wooden bird. The preacher's face went pale. The merchant looked away, unable to meet the cowboy's gaze. Something about that little bird had shaken them. Jebediah, the ranch hand, was the only one who didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed. "Give me the bird," he said, his voice flat. "Why?" the cowboy asked. "You know who made it, don't you?" Jebediah took another step forward. "That ain't your concern. Now, you can either walk away from here and keep riding, or you can get yourself buried on this patch of dirt. Your choice." The cowboy closed his fist around the wooden bird. He could feel the delicate carving press into his skin. He had come to this town with nothing. No name, no purpose, just an empty belly and a past he was trying to outrun. But now, he was holding a little girl's last memory of her father. He was standing between her and a group of angry men with guns. He had a choice to make. He could walk away. It's what he'd always done. Or he could stand his ground. For a little girl he didn't know. for a reason he didn't yet understand. He looked at Jebediah, then at the other men. He saw the fear and guilt in their eyes. They weren't here to protect the girl. They were here to protect a secret. And that little wooden bird in his hand was somehow the key. "No," the cowboy said, his voice ringing out in the clearing. "I don't think I'll be leaving." Jebediah's face hardened. He cocked the shotgun. The sound was like a death sentence in the night. "Wrong answer." The click of the shotgun hammer echoed in the silent clearing. The townsmen shifted on their feet, their lantern light dancing nervously on the trees. They hadn't come for a killing, but Jebediah was a man who got what he wanted. The little girl let out a small whimper from behind the cowboy's legs. The cowboy didn't even look at the gun pointed at his chest. His eyes were locked on Jebediah's. "You're making a mistake," the cowboy said, his voice still low and even. "The only mistake," Jebediah sneered, "was you not riding on when you had the chance." But then the preacher spoke up, his voice trembling but firm. "Jebediah, put the gun down. This is not the way." "Stay out of this, preacher," Jebediah growled. "This is town business." "This is God's business," the preacher replied, stepping forward so he was standing slightly between Jebediah and the cowboy. "And a child's life is at stake." The cowboy used the distraction. He knelt down, turning his back to the men, so he was facing the little girl. "What's your name?" he whispered. "Lily," she whispered back, her eyes wide with terror. "Lily," he said, pressing the wooden bird into her hand. "Your papa was a good man, wasn't he?" She nodded, clutching the bird to her chest. He looked up and saw the grandmother huddled by the fire, rocking back and forth. Her face was a mask of pure terror. She wasn't watching the standoff. She was staring at the wooden bird in Lily's hand. "Ma'am," the cowboy said, his voice sharp enough to cut through her fear. "What was his name?" The old woman looked at him, her eyes wild. "Don't," she pleaded. "Don't say his name. You'll bring ruin on us all." "His name!" the cowboy insisted. Outside, Jebediah was getting impatient. "I'm done talking. Preacher, get out of the way." The cowboy stood up, turning to face them again. He put himself squarely in front of the door, shielding Lily and the old woman. "His name was Caleb," the cowboy said, his voice loud and clear. A collective gasp came from the townsmen. Several of them took a step back, as if the name itself was a ghost. The preacher closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Jebediah's face went white with rage. "You shut your mouth! You don't know nothing!" "Oh, I think I do," the cowboy said. "Caleb was a woodcarver, wasn't he? The best in the county. Made beautiful things. Things people wanted." He held up his empty hand. "Things people might even kill for." The clearing was dead silent now. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the cabin. The secret was out. Or at least the edges of it were starting to show. Jebediah's knuckles were white on the stock of his shotgun. He was no longer just a bully. He looked like a cornered animal. "Caleb and his wife," the cowboy continued, his voice like a hammer striking an anvil. "They owned this land, didn't they? This whole stretch. The creek. The timber. Worth a lot of money. But they wouldn't sell." He took a step forward, out of the cabin and into the lantern light. Then one day, there was a fire. A terrible accident. Caleb and his wife were gone. And their little girl? She just disappeared. Everyone assumed she died too. How convenient. He looked from man to man. He saw the shame on their faces. They knew. They had all known, and they had all stayed quiet. "But she didn't die, did she?" the cowboy said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Her nanny, this brave old woman." He gestured back to the cabin. "She hid her. Let the town think she was just some beggar brat, her granddaughter. She kept her safe by making her invisible, by being cruel to her so no one would look too close." The old woman was openly weeping now, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Lily stood in the doorway, clutching her wooden bird, understanding dawning in her tear-filled eyes. The cowboy turned his gaze back to Jebediah. But someone knew the truth. Someone was still looking for her. Because if the girl is alive, she's the rightful owner of this land, and that someone can't have that. Can they, Jebediah? Jebediah raised the shotgun, his hands trembling with fury. I'm warning you, Drifter. You didn't act alone, did you? The cowboy pressed on, relentless. You're just the muscle. Who do you work for, Jebediah? Who wanted this land so bad they were willing to murder a family for it? He took another step, so the barrel of the shotgun was almost touching his chest. Who's the real monster in this town? Jebediah's eyes darted around at the other men, looking for support, but their faces were filled with doubt and dawning horror. They were looking at him differently now. He was trapped. And then, from the back of the crowd, a new voice spoke, calm, cold, and dripping with authority. That would be me. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was dressed in a fine suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He had a gentle smile on his face, but his eyes were as cold and dead as a winter night. It was the town's benefactor, the man who owned the ranch, the saloon, pretty much everything and everyone in Dry Creek. His name was Mr. Sterling, and as soon as the cowboy saw him, his blood ran cold. He knew that face. He had seen it once before, a long time ago, in a different town over the body of a different dead man. His past hadn't just caught up with him. It had been waiting for him here all along. Sterling walked into the clearing as if he were strolling into his own parlor. The other men parted for him, their heads bowed. Jebediah visibly relaxed, a smug look replacing the panic on his face. His boss was here. Everything was going to be fine. Sterling stopped a few feet from the cowboy. He completely ignored the shotgun in Jebediah's hands. His eyes were fixed on the cowboy. Well, well, Sterling said, his voice smooth as silk. I never thought I'd see you again. What do they call you these days? The cowboy's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. You know my name. Sterling chuckled. Yes, I suppose I do. Jacob. It's been, 10 years? Since that unpleasantness in Willow Creek? He glanced at the other men. You see, gentlemen, our mysterious drifter is not such a stranger after all. He's an old acquaintance. The townsmen looked confused, their gazes shifting between Jacob and Sterling. What's he talking about, Mr. Sterling? One of them asked. He's talking about the past, Jacob said, his voice low and dangerous. He's talking about the man I saw him kill. A wave of shock went through the crowd. Sterling simply smiled. An unfortunate misunderstanding. The law saw it my way. Self-defense. A closed case. He looked back at Jacob. A shame you didn't stick around to testify. You fled, as I recall. Made you look rather guilty yourself. It was a masterstroke. In a few sentences, Sterling had turned the tables, painting Jacob not as a hero, but as a fugitive with a grudge. This has nothing to do with Willow Creek, Jacob said, his voice tight. This is about what you did here. To Caleb. To his family. Allegations, Sterling said with a dismissive wave of his hand. From a wanted man. Who are they going to believe, Jacob? A pillar of the community who brought prosperity to this town? Or a dusty drifter with a dead man in his past? He had a point. The townsmen were already starting to look at Jacob with suspicion again. Their loyalty, bought and paid for by Sterling, was reasserting itself. But you made a mistake, Jacob said, his eyes blazing. You should have made sure Caleb was dead. Sterling's smile faltered. What are you talking about? The fire. Wasn't as thorough as you thought, a new voice said. From the darkness behind the cabin, a figure emerged, leaning heavily on a crude crutch. His face was a roadmap of scars, one side horribly burned and twisted, but his eyes were clear and full of a fire that had been banked for years. Lily gasped. Papa? The scarred man looked at his daughter, and his ruined face softened with a love so powerful it was breathtaking. Hello, my little bird, he whispered. It was Caleb. He had survived. The crowd stared, mouths agape. They were looking at a ghost. The old nanny fell to her knees, weeping with joy and disbelief. Caleb, I thought you were gone. He hid me, Martha. Caleb said, his voice raspy from disuse. "The man you know as Jacob. He found me in the woods after the fire. He got me to a doctor in the next county. He's been helping me get my strength back. He told me to wait for the right moment." Caleb turned his gaze on Sterling, and the love in his eyes was replaced by a righteous fury. "The right moment to come back and face the man who tried to murder my family and steal my home." Sterling was speechless. His perfect composure had shattered. He looked from Caleb to Jacob, his mind racing, trying to find a way out. Jebediah was equally stunned. He lowered the shotgun, his face a mask of confusion. "Boss?" he stammered. "What's going on?" "It's over, Sterling," Jacob said. "You're not talking your way out of this one." Sterling's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but he was surrounded, not by enemies, but by the very people whose lives he had controlled. And on their faces, he saw the dawning, sickening realization of the truth. Their town wasn't built on prosperity, it was built on a grave. But Sterling wasn't a man who gave up. His eyes landed on the one person in the clearing who still represented a way out: Lily. Before anyone could react, he lunged. He grabbed the little girl, pulling her in front of him as a shield. He drew a small silver pistol from his coat and pressed it to her head. "Everyone stay back!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I'll kill her! I swear I will!" The clearing erupted into chaos. Caleb screamed his daughter's name, trying to hobble forward. The townsmen recoiled in horror. Jacob stood his ground, his face a mask of cold fury. He had spent 10 years running from the memory of what Sterling had done, 10 years of guilt, of looking over his shoulder. The running stopped tonight. "Let her go, Sterling," Jacob said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No!" Sterling screamed, dragging Lily backward toward the dark woods. "Get me a horse, now, or she dies." Lily was crying, her small body rigid with terror. "Mister," she cried out, her voice thin and desperate, "don't let him take me." Jacob looked at Caleb, a silent question passing between them. Caleb, his face contorted in agony, gave a single, sharp nod. He trusted him. Jacob's hand moved in a blur. It didn't go for his gun. He reached down to his boot and drew a long, thin knife. With a flick of his wrist, he threw it. The knife spun through the air, a silver streak in the lantern light. It didn't hit Sterling. It hit the trunk of a tree just beside his head, embedding itself deep in the wood with a solid thunk. The sound, the sudden shock of it, was enough. Sterling flinched, his head turning toward the sound for a fraction of a second. It was all Jacob needed. He moved faster than anyone had ever seen a man move. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. He didn't draw his pistol. This wasn't about a gunfight. This was about justice. He hit Sterling with the force of a freight train. His fist connected with Sterling's jaw with a sickening crack. Sterling went down hard, the pistol flying from his grasp. Lily scrambled away, running into her father's waiting arms. Jacob stood over Sterling's unconscious form, his chest heaving. Around him, the clearing was silent, the townsfolk watching in stunned awe. He looked at Caleb, who was holding his daughter, his face wet with tears. He looked at Martha, the old nanny, who was smiling through her own tears. Then he looked at the faces of the men of Dry Creek. He saw the shame, the regret, and the dawning respect in their eyes. They finally understood. The measure of a man isn't the coin in his pocket or the land he owns. It's the willingness to stand for those who can't stand for themselves. Jebediah dropped his shotgun in the dirt. He walked over to Sterling's prone form and, with the help of the blacksmith, tied his hands behind his back. Justice had come to Dry Creek. It hadn't come from a sheriff or a judge. It had come in the form of a dusty drifter who stopped to share his last meal with a hungry child. As the sun began to rise, casting a clean new light over the prairie, Jacob bent down and picked up his knife from the tree. He walked over to Caleb and Lily. Lily looked up at him, her gray eyes shining. "You saved us." Jacob's throat felt tight. He managed a small smile. "Your papa and your grandma did the hard part. They kept you safe." He looked at Caleb. "The land is yours again. Sterling will pay for what he did." Caleb nodded, his eyes filled with a gratitude so deep it needed no words. "What will you do now, Jacob?" It was the question that had haunted him for 10 years. What now? Where next? He looked down at Lily. She was holding the small wooden bird, the one thing that had survived the fire, the one thing that had brought them all together. He had spent his life drifting, believing he had no ties, no home. But he realized now that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you build. Sometimes all it takes is a plate of beans, a warm fire, and the courage to stay when every instinct tells you to run. "I don't know," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion, "but for the first time in a long time, I'm not in a hurry to get anywhere." He reached out and gently rested his hand on Lily's head. And in the quiet dawn of a redeemed town, the drifter finally found his reason to stop drifting. What city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you.